You're 9 years old, and today you're becoming Pharaoh of Egypt. The golden crown is placed on your head, so heavy that your neck bends under its weight. The priests and soldiers surrounding you kneel, proclaiming you a living god. But you're just a child. You don't even know for certain who your father was, because speaking his name is forbidden. Akhenaten, the cursed Pharaoh, the one who angered everyone, who tried to impose a single god system, who then died mysteriously. And now you stand in his place. Vizier I approaches you, old, experienced, cunning. Young master, he says with a smile, we are here to guide you, but there's something in that smile. A threat, a warning. You may be Pharaoh, but who really holds the power? 10 years from now, you'll be found dead. 19 years old, a mysterious fracture in your skull. DNA tests will show malaria, but how did that fracture happen? And why was your tomb prepared in such haste, as if it wasn't really meant for you? Tonight, I'll tell you the story of the world's most famous pharaoh, but the truth behind the golden mask. A child placed on a throne, manipulated, used, and perhaps murdered. Before diving into this story of divine kingship corrupted by human ambition, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring ancient mysteries together from different parts of the world, connected across millennia by our shared fascination with the past. The year is 1332 BCE, and Egypt is in crisis. For 17 years, the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten has turned Egyptian society upside down. He's abandoned the traditional gods that Egyptians have worshipped for thousands of years, declaring that only one god exists, Aten, the sun disk. He's closed temples, stripped the powerful priesthood of Ammonius of their wealth and influence, and moved the capital from Thebes to a new city he built in the desert, Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna. But Akhenaten's religious revolution has been a disaster. The priests are furious at losing their power. The people are confused and frightened, forbidden from worshipping the gods their families have honored for generations. Egypt's international standing has collapsed as the pharaoh obsesses over his religious reforms while ignoring foreign policy. Letters found in the Amarna archives show desperate pleas from Egyptian vassals in Canaan and Syria, begging for military support against invading forces. Akhenaten ignores them all. Then, suddenly, Akhenaten disappears from the historical record. One year he's there, issuing decrees and building monuments. The next year, nothing. Some historians believe he was overthrown. Others think he died of natural causes. A few suggest he was assassinated by priests or generals who could no longer tolerate his destabilizing rule. We may never know for certain. What we do know is that a mysterious pharaoh named Smenkhare appears briefly, ruling for perhaps 2 or 3 years before also dying under unclear circumstances. And then comes the boy, Tutankhamun, as he's initially called, meaning living image of Aten. He's approximately 9 years old when he's crowned pharaoh, though the exact date is uncertain. Imagine being that child. You've grown up in Akhetaten, the strange new city your father or predecessor built in the desert. It's unlike anywhere else in Egypt, filled with temples to a single god, decorated with unusual art showing the royal family in intimate, almost casual poses rather than the rigid formality of traditional Egyptian art. Everyone around you is tense, afraid, waiting for something to change. The priests who crown you are not supporters of your father's revolution. They're representatives of the old order, the cult of Ammonius that Akhenaten tried to destroy. They see you as an opportunity, a blank slate they can mold. You're young enough to be controlled, royal enough to provide legitimacy, and malleable enough to reverse everything Akhenaten did. Standing beside you during the coronation is Enkhsenemen, your half-sister, who is now also your wife. She's about 13 years old. In any other context, this would be a shocking detail, but in royal Egyptian families, sibling marriage was not just accepted but preferred, a way to keep the divine bloodline pure. Enkhsenemen is the daughter of Akhenaten and his famous wife Nefertiti. You may also be Akhenaten's son, though the evidence is complex and DNA testing has revealed disturbing truths about your parentage that we'll explore shortly. The wedding happened quickly, before or shortly after your coronation. It wasn't about love or even dynastic alliance in the traditional sense. It was about legitimacy. Enkhsenemen carried the royal bloodline, and by marrying her, you reinforced your claim to the throne. But it was also about control. The people managing your coronation wanted to tie you to the previous dynasty while simultaneously having you reverse its policies. Within the first few years of your reign, dramatic changes occur. First, your name changes from Tutankhamun to Tutankhamun, living image of Ammonius. This is not a subtle shift. It's a public declaration that the Aten revolution is over and the old gods are restored. Enkhsenemen's name also changes, from Enkhesenpeten to Enkhsenemen. The message is clear. Akhenaten's religious experiment has failed, and Egypt is returning to tradition. Second, the capital moves back to Thebes, the ancient religious center of Egypt and home to the powerful priesthood of Ammonius. The city of Akhetaten is gradually abandoned, left to decay in the desert. Future pharaohs will use its buildings as quarries, deliberately erasing evidence of Akhenaten's reign. Third, the traditional priesthoods are restored. Temples that were closed are reopened. Rituals that were banned are performed again. The cult of Ammonius, in particular, receives enormous grants of land, gold, and authority. An inscription from your reign describes restoring temples from the marshes of the Delta to Nubia, emphasizing the comprehensive nature of the restoration. But here's the crucial question. Who's actually making these decisions? You're 9 years old when this starts. You can barely understand the complex religious and political implications of these changes. So who's really running Egypt? The answer appears to be two men, I and Hormheb. I holds the title of vizier, the highest administrative position in Egypt. He's a military commander and likely a member of the extended royal family, possibly Nefertiti's father, which would make him your grandfather or great-uncle. He's old, experienced, and politically sophisticated. Contemporary images show him with the confidence of someone who knows he's the real power behind the throne. Hormheb is the commander of the army, a military man who rose through the ranks rather than being born into royalty. He's pragmatic, efficient, and ambitious. While I handle civil administration, Hormheb manages military affairs and foreign policy, trying to restore Egypt's international position after years of neglect under Akhenaten. These two men are your handlers, your controllers, the adults who make the real decisions while you sit on the throne looking appropriately divine. You attend ceremonies. You're paraded before the people. Your image is carved on temple walls showing you making offerings to the gods. But the actual governance? That's handled by I and Hormheb. Contemporary art from your reign reveals this dynamic subtly but clearly. In traditional Egyptian royal iconography, the pharaoh is always shown as the dominant figure, larger and more central than anyone else. But in images from your reign, while you're still technically central, there's something diminished about your presence. You're young, small, often shown receiving guidance or instruction from older figures. One relief shows you being crowned by the gods themselves, but you look almost overwhelmed by the ceremony, like a child playing dress-up in adult clothes. But your physical condition makes your situation even more tragic. Modern scientific analysis of your mummy has revealed a catalog of ailments that turned your short life into one of chronic pain and disability. Let's start with the genetics because they're fundamental to understanding everything that happened to you. DNA analysis conducted in 2010 by Egyptian geneticist Hawass and his team revealed something disturbing about your family tree. Your father was Akhenaten. That's now confirmed. But your mother wasn't Nefertiti, as many historians had assumed. Your mother was a woman identified only as the younger lady, a mummy found in tomb KV35. And here's where it gets horrifying. DNA testing showed that this woman was Akhenaten's full sister. Your parents were siblings, not half-siblings, which was common in Egyptian royal families. Full siblings, same mother, same father. And this wasn't the first generation of inbreeding. The 18th dynasty had been practicing sibling marriage for generations, concentrating genetic disorders with each generation until they reached you. The physical consequences were devastating. CT scans and genetic analysis revealed that you suffered from multiple congenital conditions. You had Kolar disease, a disorder affecting foot bones that would have made walking painful. You had a club foot. Your spine showed signs of scoliosis. You had a cleft palate. One leg was longer than the other. Your immune system was compromised by genetic disorders. Most tellingly, your tomb contained 130 walking sticks. Let that sink in for a moment. You were a god king who couldn't walk without assistance. The propaganda images showing you as a strong, athletic pharaoh hunting from chariots and leading armies were complete fiction. The real you struggled to walk across a room. The malaria was another consequence of your weakened immune system. DNA analysis found traces of Plasmodium falciparum, the parasite that causes the most severe form of malaria, in your tissues. You'd been infected multiple times, at least 4 or 5 separate instances. Each infection would have left you weak, feverish, and vulnerable to other complications. Can you imagine what your daily life must have been like? You wake up in pain. Your feet hurt. Your back hurts. You're tired constantly. Your body fighting infections it can't quite overcome. Servants help you stand, help you walk, support you as you move through the palace. You're dressed in elaborate robes that hide your physical problems. You're painted and positioned to look strong and divine in official ceremonies. But the moment the ceremony ends and you're back in private quarters, you collapse, exhausted from the effort of simply appearing to be what a pharaoh should be. And through all of this, you're expected to perform your royal duties. You must participate in religious ceremonies that can last for hours, standing or sitting in uncomfortable positions while priests perform rituals. You must receive foreign ambassadors and appear commanding standing despite being a chronically ill teenager. You must make decisions about matters you barely understand while adults watch, waiting to tell you what to do. The marriage to Tutankhamun takes on additional tragic dimensions when we consider your physical condition. You were married at 9 years old to a girl who was your half-sister. The marriage would have been consummated when you reached adolescence, continuing the cycle of inbreeding that had already damaged you so severely. We know that Tutankhamun became pregnant at least twice. We know this because 2 tiny mummies were found in your tomb, carefully wrapped and placed in nested coffins. DNA analysis confirms these were your daughters. One fetus was about 5 months gestation. The other was full-term but premature, perhaps 7 or 8 months. Both had genetic disorders. Neither survived. Think about what this means. You were a teenager trying to produce an heir, the single most important duty of an Egyptian pharaoh. Your wife became pregnant twice. Both times, the babies died. These weren't random misfortunes. These were the predictable consequences of generations of inbreeding. Your genetic code was so damaged that you couldn't produce viable offspring. The little coffins in your tomb are among the most heartbreaking artifacts in Egyptian archaeology. They're beautifully made, covered in gold leaf, inscribed with spells to protect the unborn children in the afterlife. Someone, probably Tutankhamun, made sure these babies were buried with proper honors despite never being born alive. The grief embedded in those tiny coffins is palpable even 3,300 years later. As you approach your late teens, your health deteriorates further. The exact sequence of events in your final months is uncertain, but we can reconstruct a probable scenario based on physical evidence. You're about 19 years old. You've been pharaoh for 10 years, which sounds impressive until you remember that you've been a puppet the entire time. I is now in his 60s, but still firmly in control of the administration. Horemheb has successfully restored some of Egypt's military prestige through campaigns in Nubia and the Levant. The temples are rebuilt. The priests are satisfied. Egypt has returned to stability and traditional order. But you're a problem. You've failed to produce an heir. Your health is declining. You're becoming less useful as a figurehead and potentially more troublesome if you start developing your own opinions about how Egypt should be run. Some historians believe you might have been attempting to assert more independence in your final year, trying to transition from puppet to actual ruler. If so, this would have made you dangerous to the men who'd been controlling you since childhood. Then something happens. Maybe it's an accident. Maybe it's not. Your left leg is broken, a fracture that shatters the femur. This is devastating for someone with your fragile health. In an era before antibiotics, any serious wound carried the risk of fatal infection. A broken femur would have left you bedridden, completely dependent on others. CT scans of your mummy show this fracture clearly. They also show something else. The break occurred at or very shortly before your death. There was no time for healing to begin. Whatever broke your leg happened right at the end of your life. Here's where the theories get dark. Some Egyptologists believe the break was accidental, perhaps from a fall or chariot accident, and the subsequent infection killed you. But others point to additional evidence that suggests something more sinister. Your skull shows damage consistent with a blow to the head. Now, some of this damage might have occurred during the mummification process or from Howard Carter's team in the 1920s when they had to literally chisel your mummy out of the coffin because the resins had hardened around it. But the location and pattern of some fractures suggest they might have occurred perimortem, around the time of death. There's also the matter of your chest. The front of your rib cage and sternum are completely missing. They're not damaged or broken. They're gone. Again, this might be mummification damage or later disturbance, but it's unusual, almost as if someone removed them deliberately. The final piece of suspicious evidence is the rushed nature of your burial. Your tomb is tiny, barely more than a large chamber with a few side rooms. It's completely inadequate for a pharaoh. Most royal tombs took decades to carve and decorate. Yours appears to have been prepared in a matter of weeks or months. The walls are painted but not carefully. There are mistakes and hasty corrections. The paint wasn't even fully dry when the tomb was sealed. We can tell because it's smudged in places. The shrine boxes containing your sarcophagus don't quite fit the chamber. They had to be squeezed in, leaving gaps and awkward angles. Your sarcophagus itself has evidence of having been modified. The face on the second coffin appears to have been recarved, suggesting it might have originally been made for someone else. Everything about your burial suggests emergency preparations, as if someone died unexpectedly and had to be buried quickly using whatever was available. But pharaohs didn't die unexpectedly. They had tombs prepared throughout their reigns. Unless, of course, someone hadn't expected you to die quite so soon. Within months of your death, I marries Tutankhamun and declares himself pharaoh. This is extraordinary. I was never in the line of succession. He wasn't royal blood, but he was the power behind your throne, and now he's seizing that throne openly. The marriage to your widow gives him a thin veneer veneer of legitimacy, connecting him to the royal bloodline. But Ankhesenamun doesn't go quietly. Before I could force the marriage, she did something unprecedented in Egyptian history. She wrote to the king of the Hittites, Egypt's traditional enemy. The letter, preserved in Hittite archives, is desperate. My husband has died and I have no son. They say you have many sons. Send me one of your sons so that he can become my husband. I will never take a servant as my husband. That last line is crucial. I will never take a servant as my husband. She's talking about I. She's so desperate to avoid marrying him that she's willing to marry an enemy prince instead. The Hittite king, suspicious that this might be a trap, delays. He sends an ambassador to investigate. Eventually, convinced the offer is genuine, he sends his son Zenanza to Egypt to marry the widowed queen. But Zenanza never makes it. He's murdered at the Egyptian border. Who ordered the killing? The most likely suspect is I, eliminating the foreign prince who threatened his plans. Forced into marriage with I, Ankhesenamun disappears from history. She's shown in one scene with I, a painting in his tomb showing her performing a ceremony. After that, nothing. No tomb has ever been found for her. No further records mention her. She simply vanishes, erased as thoroughly as her father Akhenaten's monuments. I rules for only 4 years before dying. He's followed by Hormheb, the military commander, who finally achieves what he'd probably wanted all along, the throne itself. And Hormheb launches a systematic campaign to erase the entire Amarna period from history. Akhenaten's name is chiseled off monuments. His city is abandoned and forgotten. And you, Tutankhamun, despite being a pharaoh who restored traditional religion, are also erased. Your name is removed from king lists. Your monuments are usurped, your cartouches replaced with Hormheb's. Later pharaohs, when they must reference the period, count the years from Amenhotep III directly to Hormheb, as if the intervening pharaohs, including you, never existed. Why? Because you were tainted by association with Akhenaten. You were part of the heretic dynasty, the cursed bloodline that nearly destroyed Egypt. Better to forget you entirely, to act as if that whole period was a bad dream from which Egypt finally awoke. And this erasure was remarkably successful. By the time of classical Greece and Rome, Tutankhamun was completely forgotten. Greek historians who wrote about Egypt never mention you. Roman tourists who visited Egyptian monuments never saw your name. It had been erased. For over 3,000 years, you were lost to history. Then, in 1922, Howard Carter made the discovery that changed everything. After years of searching in the Valley of the Kings, he found a small, almost insignificant tomb entrance buried under debris from later construction. The seals were intact. Nothing had been disturbed since ancient times. On November 26, 1922, Carter made a small hole in the door and held up a candle. "Can you see anything?" asked his patron, Lord Carnarvon. Carter's response became famous. "Yes, wonderful things." The tomb was relatively small, but it was packed with thousands of objects. Unlike every other royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings, which had been thoroughly robbed in ancient times, yours was substantially intact. There were chariots, thrones, beds, boxes of clothes, weapons, jewelry, and religious items. And in the burial chamber, nested within 4 golden shrines, a stone sarcophagus containing 3 coffins, the innermost made of solid gold. When Carter finally removed the burial mask and examined your mummy, he found a broken body. The techniques used to examine mummies in the 1920s were crude by modern standards. Carter's team had to use hot knives to separate your body from the hardened resins, causing significant damage. But even then, the evidence of physical problems was clear. Modern science has revealed much more. CT scans, genetic analysis, and careful study of your remains have painted a picture of a young man who suffered throughout his short life. You couldn't walk without assistance. You were in constant pain. You suffered from chronic infections. You were unable to father healthy children. And you died young, possibly from complications of your various conditions, possibly from something more sinister. Your golden mask, one of the most recognized artifacts in human history, shows an idealized version of you. The face is beautiful, serene, eternally young. It's the face of a god-king, powerful and divine. But behind that mask was a very different reality. A sick child used as a political tool by ambitious men. A teenager struggling with genetic disorders that made every day a challenge. A young man desperate to produce an heir but biologically incapable of doing so. The mask is a lie, but perhaps a necessary one. Ancient Egyptians believed that images had power, that representations could become real in the afterlife. Maybe that golden face, so perfect and strong, was meant to transform you in death into what you never could be in life. Maybe in the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, you finally had the strong body and healthy life that genetics and circumstance denied you in this world. But there's something deeply sad about the disconnect between image and reality. Millions of people visit your golden mask every year in the Cairo Museum. They see divinity, power, ancient majesty. Very few think about the reality. A disabled teenager who couldn't walk without help, who watched both his babies die, who was controlled by adults his entire life, and who died young, possibly murdered by the very people who were supposed to protect him. Your story raises uncomfortable questions about power and vulnerability. You were supposedly the most powerful person in one of the ancient world's greatest civilizations. You were a god king, worshipped by millions, owner of all Egypt, yet you had no real power at all. You were a symbol, a puppet, a figurehead used by others to legitimize their decisions. The adults around you kept you on the throne because you were useful. You provided continuity with the previous dynasty while being young enough to control. You gave legitimacy to the restoration of traditional religion. Your marriage to Tutankhamun connected you to the royal bloodline. As long as you played your role, smiled at ceremonies, allowed your image to be used, you were valuable. But the moment you might have tried to assert real independence, or the moment your health made you more trouble than you were worth, your usefulness ended. And in ancient Egypt, when a pharaoh's usefulness ended, their life often ended as well. We'll never know for certain if you were murdered. The evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. What we do know is that you died young, were buried hastily, your widow was forced into an unwanted marriage, and your memory was systematically erased by your successors. That pattern suggests something darker than simple disease and natural death. But perhaps the greatest tragedy is how thoroughly the erasure worked. For over 3 millennia, you were forgotten. The men who controlled you succeeded in writing you out of history. Your monuments were usurped. Your name was removed from king lists. Future generations of Egyptians had no idea you ever existed. And yet, paradoxically, that erasure led to your modern fame. Because your tomb was forgotten, it wasn't robbed like the others. Because robbers didn't find it, Howard Carter did. Because Carter found it intact, the world discovered the most complete royal burial ever found in Egypt. Your golden mask became one of the most famous artifacts in human history. The men who tried to erase you from memory inadvertently ensured you'd be remembered forever, just not in the way they intended. They wanted to forget the weak puppet pharaoh who reminded Egypt of the heretic dynasty. Instead, the world remembers you as the quintessential Egyptian pharaoh, the face of ancient Egypt itself. There's a kind of justice in that, even if it's accidental. Hormeb got their power, got their place in history as pharaohs. But today, far more people know your name than theirs. Your mask is recognized worldwide. Your story fascinates millions. Meanwhile, most people couldn't pick or Hormeb out of a lineup of ancient Egyptian rulers. But beyond the fame and the golden artifacts, we should remember you as you actually were. A child forced into an impossible situation, a teenager suffering from genetic disorders that made life painful and brief, a young man trying to do his duty despite overwhelming obstacles, and ultimately, a victim of the same system that elevated him to godhood. Your body, twisted and broken, tells a story that your golden mask conceals. It's a story about the human cost of power, the cruelty of genetic destiny, and the vulnerability of even those who are supposedly divine. You were called a god, but you died like any other human, probably afraid, certainly in pain, possibly betrayed by those closest to you. The 2 tiny mummies buried with you, your stillborn daughters, drive home the full tragedy. You and Tutankhamun tried to continue the royal line, tried to produce the heir that was your primary duty as pharaoh. But genetics made it impossible. The same inbreeding that was supposed to keep the royal bloodline pure had actually poisoned it, ensuring that each generation was weaker than the last until it reached you and simply stopped. In a very real sense, you were the end of a line. Hormeb weren't your relatives. They represented a new beginning, non-royal men who seized power because the old royal family had bred itself into genetic oblivion. The 19th dynasty that followed Hormeb had no connection to your family. A new royal line began, one that carefully avoided the kind of close inbreeding that had destroyed yours. Your legacy, then, is complicated. You're famous, but for reasons that would have horrified ancient Egyptians. You're remembered, but the memory is of golden treasures rather than human suffering. You're recognized worldwide, but as a symbol rather than as the disabled teenager you actually were. Perhaps that's fitting for someone who spent their entire life being a symbol rather than being allowed to simply be human. From the moment of your birth, you were a political pawn. Your value was in your bloodline, not your personality. Your purpose was to sit on the throne and look divine, not to actually rule. Even your body wasn't fully your own. It was reshaped through artistic representation to match the ideal of pharaonic power rather than its painful reality. 3,000 years later, we've done something similar. We've taken your image, your golden mask, your treasures, and made them symbols of ancient Egyptian grandeur while largely ignoring the suffering and humanity behind them. We celebrate the gold while forgetting the pain. But tonight we remember. We remember the boy forced onto a throne at 9 years old. We remember the teenager who couldn't walk without help. We remember the young man who watched his babies die. today. We remember the person behind the propaganda, the human being beneath the God King costume. Your name was Tutankhamun, and you deserved better than the life you got. Better than the broken body genetics gave you. Better than the controlling handlers who used you. Better than the erasure your successors attempted. And better than the modern fame that celebrates your treasures while forgetting your trauma. The golden mask in Cairo Museum is beautiful, and it should be preserved and celebrated as the magnificent artwork it is. But we should never forget that behind that serene golden face was a real person who suffered, who tried despite impossible odds, and who died young, leaving behind only questions, golden artifacts, and 2 tiny coffins containing the daughters who never lived. That's the real story of Tutankhamun, not a tale of curse or glory, but a very human tragedy about a child crushed by the weight of divine kingship and the cruelty of genetic fate. Remember the mask, yes, but remember more the person it was meant to transform and protect, a boy named Tutankhamun who never had the chance to simply be.